Welcome to episode 260 of Sports Geek. On this week's episode, I chat with Peter Sorckoff about fan experience, brand, and the beginnings of KissCam.
Welcome to Sports Geek, the podcast built for sports digital and sports business professionals. And now, here's your host who is hosting a meetup in your city soon, Sean Callanan.
Thanks, DJ Joel. Yes, my name is Sean Callanan. You can find me at Sports Geek HQ, which is where the Sports Geek podcast is hosted. You can also get Sports Geek News at sportsgeekhq.com, or you can find this podcast on all good podcast platforms. If you listen to Sports Geek on Spotify, let me know. Did it make your Spotify Wrapped? Send me a message at Sean Callanan, or send me an email the old-fashioned way, Sean at sportsgeekhq.com. And yes, as DJ Joel said there at the start, I'm looking forward to meeting up with listeners in meetups in different cities around the world. We're going to be firing up Sports Biz Melb in earnest in 2020 after a successful comeback in Richmond last month. We're going to have one every month. So check out Sports Business Melbourne on Meetup if you want to join up and connect and network and do what and share some stories. Steal with pride, as I say on the podcast. Learn from others and see how you can implement it for yourself. Before I get in this chat with Peter Sorckoff, just a quick one on the Patreon campaign. You can support the Patreon campaign, which supports content like this podcast and our newsletters, by going to sportsgeekhq.com/Patreon. It helps pay for the costs of the podcast, producing the podcast, the editing of the podcast, the booking of the guests, the creation of the show notes, the creation of the newsletters, and the like. So if you're listening to it for your personal growth and getting value out of these interviews, which I hope you are, you can become a personal supporter for only $4 a month. That gets you normally 4 podcasts a month, a couple of now Q&A podcasts, and if you're a Sports Geek News subscriber, you'll also get a weekly Sports Geek News EDM of all the different articles that I read and share on my social media channels. And if you're a brand that wants to play in the sports technology, marketing, digital space, and want to reach the Sports Geek audience, the best way to do that is become a supporter via the Patreon campaign. If you become a supporter, your link and logo will be in every single show notes like this one, sportsgeekhq.com/60, 260, I should say. And you'll also get a shout out when you start subscribing to the Patreon campaign. So please check that out, sportsgeekhq.com/Patreon. And now here is my chat with Peter Sorckoff. Very happy to catch up with a good friend of mine. This has been an episode long time in the planning. We keep catching up at different conferences in different parts around the world, and we never actually pull out the recording equipment. That's my fault, not your fault. Peter Sorckoff, founder of SEA. Welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thanks, Sean. You're right. It has been a long time coming, but very excited to join you.
Yeah, so I guess as I sort of start, you've got a long and varied career in the world of sport. But how did you get your start in the sports business?
Well, I kind of fell into it, to be totally honest with you, and it was long enough ago that you could fall into it. I don't know that it can happen that way as often, maybe as it did in those days. I really was in a therapeutic environment, really doing the work of a therapist.
Yep.
And had a side business because I'm a big gearhead, could never afford the cars that I loved, and so I brokered them on the side. Had a customer, long story short, who had a car and it sold really fast. He was very happy. He happened to be the president of a hockey team. And he said, basically, you have to come work for me. And long story short, he found a way to make it appealing enough that I jumped ship, which really wasn't that difficult because as a Canadian kid, the idea of being paid to work in hockey was just an absolute dream come true.
So that was the Calgary Flames?
So it was actually the Calgary Hitmen.
Okay.
My first boss was Brett the Hitman Hart.
Okay.
And the team was also owned by a couple of, actually at that time, active NHL players, Joe Sakic, who's now the general manager of the Colorado Avalanche, and Theron Fleury. And so we were a brand new Western Hockey League franchise. But 2 years after that, the team was acquired by the Calgary Flames, and I was acquired as a part of that.
Okay, and so what was your initial, because sports startups, and I guess in that space it is that. So was it a bit of do everything? So you sort of got a good view of the whole part of the business, or was there a particular focus in those early roles?
No, it really was. It was a little bit like probably what some people would equate to AAA baseball. So small staff where, you're really forced to learn a lot of parts of the business, which, hindsight, I'm very grateful for. So, I did sponsorship work. I was the director of marketing, the director of promotions, the director of entertainment, and the director of public relations. So, the one thing that you also learned very quickly was not just all those elements of the business, but how to integrate them. Because that just, was a necessity. And then that led into retail. But really my passion at that time, we didn't call it game presentation. It was just game ops. Is what I was really drawn to. And look, this was long enough ago that not every building and every team actually had a video board at that time. So, we were doing things that were just, fun, never been done. It was a little bit like the Wild Wild West.
Yeah, that is just really just entertaining the fans in between the breaks and that kind of stuff. Like you said before we had Kiss Cam and Jumbotron, and that was the way that the fans were engaged. It was sort of playing around with those different ideas.
Well, yeah, no, absolutely. And the fun part was there was no expectation to it because, no one was using terms like experience. That was just not in anyone's lexicon. People came solely for the sport. And then as broadcast started to become, a bigger and bigger player financially, breaks started to appear. And then it was like, look, we've got to do something to, kind of make these breaks feel less painful, because you could only play music for so long or have an organist, hammer the keys for so long before it started to sort of suck the life out of the building. So interestingly enough that you bring it up, the Kiss Cam actually started in Calgary as a total lark where, we started, panning cameras around and playing a song. And that's literally, to the best of my knowledge, the first ever Kiss Cam, which came out of the Calgary Flames. Just, again, pure necessity to fill a break. We thought it was fun putting people on camera because they did goofy things when they saw themselves. And then, the song actually called for people to kiss. And, sort of that was born. And that's when we started to realize, oh, wait a minute, this is kind of a thing. Because people laughed. And you typically didn't ever really hear people laugh at a game. And so we'd had a mascot even before a video board. His name at that time was Harvey the Hound. In fact, it still is. To give you an idea, it was so long ago that Harvey the Hound, his mascot costume was actually made out of sheepskin.
Okay.
So imagine a guy running around for 3 hours in a giant sheepskin suit and how hot that would have been. But when we saw people laugh, that's when we realized we could actually orchestrate that. And that became really important when you were losing because it was a way to sort of distract people from the fact that the team wasn't performing the way that we had hoped. And then it just started to blossom. We started bringing movie clips into the game environment. And at that time, there were no such thing as sync rights and catalog rights and things like that. We started cutting what we called sport shorts, which were, we would record literally things off of TV. I think ABC had funniest crashes and things like that. And we would recut them and put sound effects to them. And, we came up with the teddy bear toss, which was because we had no money to go buy toys for the players to take to the hospital at Christmas time. So literally we said, well, why don't we ask everybody to bring a teddy bear to the game? And when we score our first goal, they'll be allowed to throw it on the ice. So, we thought maybe, I don't know, a couple dozen people would bring a teddy bear. we had to actually call the first period and send the teams to the dressing room because it took us almost 25 minutes to clean all the teddy bears off the ice. And I can tell you, it was an absolutely awesome moment because each player, when he went to the children's hospital, literally had 2 garbage bags full of teddy bears that, you know, he would just pile them on kids' beds. Yep. So that's when we started to realize, wait a minute, like there's real power here. And you know, we started kind of testing, like, what else could we get people to do? And, you know, fast forward that, you know, years later, we started to bring technology into the equation, and, you know, we did the first ever night with Tinder, swipe right night, which, you know, I know you're aware of. And so, you know, the sort of that spirit just kind of carried on even after I got out of sort of the game presentation space and moved into some other roles. That's always been sort of a central focus for me. So
and therefore one of the themes is, and, you know, you sort of spoke a bit there. You've gone from Calgary to Atlanta, the Spirit, and then the Hawks. One of the themes when you look at your LinkedIn is creative is a big part of your title in multiple of those roles. If, you know, game operations and creative probably doesn't make sense initially, but when you're talking about how can you engage fans, how do you make them laugh, that creative part of it is super important. How much did you find that starting to work in sports and see these little moments like the teddy bear toss and started digging further into that and sort of that being your focus from a career point of view?
Yeah, you know, I'm again very fortunate that I've been allowed to sort of work in a lot of different areas of the business. But the one thing that I kept coming back to was if I traded in the currency of creative, you were never irrelevant. Yep. Because you need creative in sponsorship, you need creative in marketing, you need creative in creative, you need creative in production. You know, and creative doesn't, you know, to me always mean art. It's really sort of an approach or a way of thinking about how you're going to solve something or enhance something or bring something new to sort of the table. And so even when I probably my title should have been CMO, I had no interest in that title because I honestly don't really like what it means. And that's not to say I don't like marketing, but it's a little hemmed in, and people have a certain expectation of what you're going to be in that role. And even, you know, chief revenue officer is sort of a hemmed in role as well. So creative was actually a way for me to continue to differentiate how I was approaching things. And what it also said to my teams or the folks that reported to me and that I worked with all the time was that was going to be central to everything that we brought to the table. And so it also allowed us to kind of stay in the pole position where, you know, when I became a brand manager, you know, what we always wanted was everybody looking to us to say what they were going to do instead of, you know, us looking to other teams to say, how do we replicate that? Yep. And partly that's how we drove revenue, because we knew that brands that were our partners would pay for that association. So, you know, there was definitely a business strategy in all of that as well. It wasn't, you know, it wasn't about sort of being egomaniacal and always trying to be first in things, because I think that can wear out really, really fast. And I've seen that wear out. But at the end of the day, you know, and we're seeing it now where that word experience is just everywhere. You only have experiences because creative is driving it.
So then how do you, I mean, early on, you're seen as creative because you're the one coming out with all of these great ideas, either yourself individually when you're early in the role, or then as you're building a team, how do you give your team that permission to be creative? Because like you said, most roles hem people in and, hey, we've got to put out this content because this is the next game's coming up, or we've got to run the game ops because there's a game. How do you give them enough, enough freedom to be creative? Because creative is really hard when it's boxed in and said, "Oh, can you be creative in the next 60 minutes?" It's not something that is easy to do. How do you, enable that culture both within your team, but then the wider part of the team to say we do want to do things differently, and it means we have to do it this way?
Well, look, I think you absolutely used the right word when you said build a culture, because, obviously later in my career, when I was in a position to actually be helping to make culture, you can let people fail. And I think that's a big part of it, right? That a lot of ideas don't work. But the best ideas are ones that get tried. Because lots of people have lots of great ideas, right? But what makes a good idea great is it actually gets executed. And so the heavy emphasis has always been, it's okay to fail. Like, we're trying to make a seamless presentation of ourselves, but we're also a sports team. And so, if you look at winning percentage, even the All Blacks, who win at like 887 is their all-time winning percentage. Well, that just basically tells me that, about 20% of the time they fail, or actually 13% of the time they fail. So in sports, failure is actually part of it all the time. But sometimes it doesn't get looked at in that way, right? Sort of related to winning percentage. So I think that's a huge component of it. And then, the other thing that I would spend a lot of time with my teams working on, and even when that team was like, only one other person that was reporting to me, was this idea that, what is it that somebody's really buying when they come to an event, when they come to a game? What are they really buying? And they're buying a little bit of escape, right? They're buying from the regular world. So they want to be amused. And they're also, like, if you think about sports, it's a huge leap of faith, okay? Because in our normal lives, we almost never put ourselves in situations where we don't know what the outcome of something is going to be. That's a very uncomfortable scenario for human beings. But sports seems to be the one place where we actually relish the idea of going somewhere where we just don't know how it's going to end. And we have this really sort of irrational idea that if we all band together, we can will the future to come to fruition the way we want it to. Right. So it's like, we're all going to go and cheer as hard as we can for our team, and that's going to make them win. Well, rationally, we know that has almost zero impact. Right. But I think, when as a creative, when you realize like that's what we're dealing with in this environment, then you have to be able to embrace that and keep finding ways to basically like fill those needs for people. Because it's just such an emotional space, right? Like people come, I really think, to sports events because they're allowed to be emotional there. And in a lot of parts of the rest of their life, that's just kind of like not really called for. So if you think about it, you pay for the right to go spend way too much money for a drink or a beer, food that's not that great, and parking. You go buy a shirt that's exorbitantly expensive that you're going to probably wear a half dozen times a year, maybe, with some other man's name on the back of it, right? Like all of these super irrational behaviors. Oh, by the way, you're allowed to yell at authority figures. In fact, it's so encouraged that we make authority figures wear black and white striped shirts. Right? Like you're just not allowed to do any of those things in the rest of your life. And so, having that context for teams to be able to go say, okay, now how do you build something that's going to speak to all of that? Whether that's a game presentation, content, or frankly, a marketing campaign or a sponsorship activation, right? Because that's really what brands are buying. They're buying association with that environment. And so I think when people really start to understand that, it kind of releases them to think differently, which to me is always where creativity comes from.
Yeah, I think it is the important piece there is that experience piece, because you're right. We still are going to movies in droves, but we know the outcome. We know what we're going to get, and that I find it strange when I sometimes talk to teams that stop being creative or stop doing things because the performance of the team aren't going well, and it's like, oh, well, we don't want to make a name for ourselves because the team's not going well and the fans are upset, and when really they should be like leaning into the fans are so super passionate because they love the team and they love the experience, and you're only going to have one NBA team win a title every year, and you're only going to have one AFL team win a championship every year. Like, not everyone can win. So you've really got to double down on that experience piece and why people are there, and not just be the success of the whole day is whether, you win or lose.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. That is the value quotient. What you just defined is literally the value quotient for a fan, because you may be able to look at the beginning of the year and say, my team's going to be terrible this year, right? Like, you could just look at the roster and you may be rebuilding, or, your star players are hurt, or, whatever the reason is. And fans actually know that, but they still go and they still spend, and they still spend their time on it. Right. So that's where we started trying to get to, like, why is that? Like, how do we understand that more so that we can go actually make them things that fulfill whatever that need or whatever that reason is? And that, for a long time, honestly, Sean, that really sort of stumped me. Yep. And that's where the old therapist in me, was trying to understand the psychology of that. And again, I think it was just instinct early on, because we would do things and see a reaction. And so that was almost like an A/B test. Yeah. And so it was very unsophisticated at that time. But again, what we saw was, holy cow, we can actually shape behavior here. Like, people, they actually want to be led through things. So even like when an organist plays a little call and response song like Have a Nagila, right? Or, Charge or something like that, people clap their hands and they say charge, or, these little things that were cues to us that in that environment that they literally were actually asking for and almost craving that.
And so, big part of your work at the Hawks was the rebrand, and then also the experience piece around what the stadium and how it evolved through its renovations. How did that process start? And then also, connect some of those dots of, well, this is what our fans want, or this is what we think our fans want. And how do you do that A/B testing with such a big project like that?
Well, look, the rebrand and the repositioning of the Hawks was a response to a business problem. And, we were in a situation where the team was actually winning. They were going to the playoffs, and people just still weren't showing up. Yep. So, the marketer in me looked at, okay, are we priced right? Are we positioned right? Is the product being put in front of the right audience at the right time? Those are sort of the fundamentals. And then we looked, because the NBA is so good about sharing best practices, we were able to look at what every other team was doing, and we were going, well, wait a minute, we're buying the same kind of media and spending about the same amount, and why is this not working? And that's when I think we started to really build this hypothesis that we actually have a brand problem, and it's systemic. It's not operational. It's not about execution. And so, when I got the buy-in really from ownership to sort of advance that hypothesis, we ran a research study that's really called social anthropology, and we did a scrape of the social space to try to understand what were all the conversations that were happening about the brand. Because, when you're in it, you think you know what people are talking about. But I think what I realized was we're just so close to it because you're living it every day. Did we really know what people were talking about? Yeah. And when the study, results started coming back in, we were absolutely shocked, because everything that we thought people were talking about, they were not talking about. And what they were talking about, we had never even imagined or dreamed of. And so again, just to give you a sense for that, one of the findings, in fact, it was the number 2 finding. And to give you a sense of the scope of this, there were 3.5 billion digital conversations that we had access to. And once we built all the linguistic algorithms, there were about 1.7 million related to us. And so, it was a huge amount of data. The number 2 finding that came back from all that data was that the marketplace was still talking about how much they resented the brand and the property for how we handled the Dominique Wilkins trade 20 plus years ago.
Yep.
Right? In a million years, Sean, I would have never thought that was even a possibility. And so what we recognized was, people weren't coming because they were still resentful at us. And it was kind of, the underlying, codified message to that was, if you'll treat that guy that way, then how are you going to treat me as Joe Fan?
Yeah.
And so, that gave us some very, very different insights. And so, by the way, that led to us building a statue of Dominique Wilkins, which still stands out in front of the stadium, because that was our way of literally saying to the marketplace, hey, by the way, we're totally sorry. We massively screwed that up.
It was just a really key brand repair task, really.
Oh, yeah, without question, right? Now, we could have sat there and thought of a billion different ticket promotions and, different ways to spend our ad dollars, which would have never, ever fixed that problem. So, once we started to understand that, there were also other interesting insights about, how much sort of nostalgia there was around past teams and past marks and logos, which we had buried in our past because we were embarrassed of those logos because we felt like when we used those logos, we'd never won.
Yep.
But really what the market was saying is, we loved those times because we loved those players.
Yep.
And so that actually was, part of the insight that made us, rethink the whole Pac-Man mark. And, we put a future facing spin on it, but the core DNA of that mark was very much reminiscent of, when it came online in the early 80s. And then with our uniforms and, what we did with the rest of the visual identity, that was about trying to become relevant to an audience that we had very, very little traction with. And at that time, because this is a few years ago, it was kind of the term millennial was still not really being thrown around a ton.
Yep.
And when we looked at our marketplace, it's very young, very diverse, and no one was serving that audience. And that's why we really decided that, we had to visually make ourselves relevant and at the same time sort of balance knowing that was going to alienate older fans because the colors were just radically different than anything that else had been sort of seen in our space. And then we started doing things like I mentioned, like the Tinder night, which again, that was about building relevance with a digital tool that people that age are using every day. Now, a few years later, it's kind of jumped the shark, and I think it's guys our age using Tinder.
But not for me. If my partner's listening, I'm not using Tinder. But don't put words in my mouth, Peter.
Did I?
No, but I do agree. Because I think that rebrand piece had that massive nostalgia piece, and I remember those Atlanta teams with Tree Rollins and Dominique Wilkins and Doc Rivers and the like. But you also had that challenge and to connect with the new hot Atlanta, where it was very urban and hip hop was growing, and Atlanta is a different town, and it has all these cool, fresh things happening, and you had to also make a connection with that market.
Well, and that's why we went to music as well, right? Yep. So, what we knew at that time about millennials, which I know is still true today, is really the three core passion points for them are sports/entertainment, music, and fashion. And so we brought music into the space and partnered with some local hip hop artists who honestly really bought into what we were doing. Because the other piece of it was we were, trying to really recognize talent that was Atlanta born and doing great things for the city so that we could become the team of the city. Now, it's easy to say that in words and in sort of marketing slogans. But again, this is where, to me, the difference between a good idea and a great idea is execution.
Completely.
And so, we could say it, but we had to actually go live it. And honestly, it was a lot of fun, to be totally frank with you. And at my time, my boss, Steve Koonin, who is still the CEO of the Hawks, literally said to me, Peter, if there's not a group of people out there who just absolutely hates what you do and come up with for these uniforms and our marks, then you have failed.
Yeah.
So, to have a boss who, empowered us that way was just, honestly kind of rare, to be really frank. So a lot of great things came together at the right time in the right city. And then our team really took off too. And that was just super fun. But what was really actually maybe most gratifying to me was we had non-sports brands start coming to us and saying like, hey, we'd like to learn, like, what was the thinking behind how you guys came up with this?
Yeah.
And I mean, brands like AB InBev, like the Budweiser team, including their CMO, flew to Atlanta to meet with us because they wanted to sort of hear the story of all of this, and Coke. And so that's when we kind of felt like, man, I think we might have really just done something.
Yeah. It is really a piece that sports probably underplays, some of the stuff that they do, understanding their fans, that brands are still trying to figure out themselves, which did lead you to, I guess, a role where the funny thing about sports is, brand and is so important, but a lot of the time it's a big brand logo, but a small team behind it, even at a pro team level. You're lucky enough to work with Coca-Cola, which is same thing, massive brand, but also a massive team behind it. How were you able to apply some of those strategies to in the machine that is Coca-Cola?
Well, I think, one of the things that's always been amazing to me about Coke is as big as they are, and they're obviously just absolutely humongous, arguably the biggest brand in the world. Yep. They have been thinking about things like this for decades. Now the execution of it in sports, I would say, is trickier because they're just so big unless you have somebody who really sort of understands all of those nuances of that space. Because, I mean, you and I both know, like, sports is just a really strange creature. Yep. And if you apply sort of typical business tactics to it, you will almost inevitably fail. Mm-hmm. But the premise of why we were trying to do the things that we were doing are not really that different in a place like Coke, to be honest with you. And so, some of it was again about saying, back to those old days of sort of Western Hockey League, and that kind of AAA approach where you sort of start acting as almost like this master integrator. So you've got a lot of really bright people doing a lot of amazing things. And all you're really doing is helping them connect dots and pieces, because they just need a couple of those aha moments. Mm-hmm. And then, you have the beauty of just sort of the massive amount of resources that they have behind them. And I think also just this incredible willingness to experiment. And again, I was just having a conversation with somebody actually today about the freestyle machine. And, most people think like, oh, a freestyle machine is just it's a really sort of fancy drink dispenser where you can customize. And it's like, well, yeah, it is. And they're extremely expensive. But most people don't realize that same drink machine is Wi-Fi enabled and connected, and at the end of every day basically relays back to the mothership in Atlanta from wherever those freestyle machines are, what syrup and what drinks got poured in that machine. And that data is then actually used for Coke to determine what they're going to put in cans and bottles in the future, right? So
it's live online market research.
Oh, every day from every corner of the world, right? It's just absolutely astounding. So, if you think about creative, right? Like, who came up with that idea? And a very real business imperative behind it. But, the thinking that goes behind that. And then on top of that, while the machine is in effect giving you that kind of insight, it's also creating an experience for the individual who gets to actually, play with a touch screen and real time customize a product that they actually get to then pick up and consume. Right. Yep. And that's where I think you're going to see in the future, like the Nikes and the Adidas and New Balance of the worlds, where you're going to, I really believe this, you're going to go to a shoe store or a retail outlet, and they're going to have a sole, an upper, and then yarn. And you're going to pick, what yarn you want knit into your upper. And then it's literally going to knit it right in front of you and connect it to that sole, where you will literally customize and watch your shoe be made in front of you. I don't think we're far from that. In fact, I think they may already be testing those things, but where that could actually become consumer ready. Just awesome stuff for people in sports to be able to kind of like glean inspiration from.
So then, I guess now having a breadth of experience in the sports scene and now working with brands and helping them understand their fans, like where's your head at, and what is fandom, and what is the makeup of a fan and understanding a fan? Where do you now see that, look at that fan lens?
So, it's like I said to you, it's been a passion really from the very, very beginning. There is some amazing research that has been done in the last number of years to basically start breaking down and understanding what the social psychology behind fandom is. And frankly, there are cultural anthropologists who are also looking at fandom, because while you and I are sort of biased and we see it in sports because that's just a world that we have been blessed enough to sort of be around for a long time. Yep. Fandom is not unique to sports, right? Fandom is in entertainment, in movies and television. Fandom is in comic books and books. It's in technology. It's in fashion and music. It's even in architecture. And so as we started going deeper into that space with the thought of, if we could really understand fandom, then it would give us this very unique new sort of dimension of insight to build strategy from. And so that's really what SEER is all about. And we've just been very lucky to be able to sort of bring that both on the property side with sports teams and leagues, but then also on the brand side to say, look, not only if you're going to be in sports, do you need to think about the audience in this way, but even if you're not in sports, you need to start thinking of audiences as fans of things, because our culture is changing so rapidly right now and accelerated by technology that the old sort of pillars that held everything together, like organized religion and government and military and things like that, are all breaking down. Okay. And so what you're seeing, and I'll give you a totally different example of this, SoulCycle, right, as a brand, has literally become a church. Like people go to SoulCycle in a very religious way, and when you hear them actually talk about the class leader, they talk about them almost as a pseudo divine figure, like a priest or a rabbi or a pastor, and they're actually going and getting in a SoulCycle class in a gym what people used to get out of going to church. Yep. And so when you start to, again, in the sports space, realize that's how people are actually starting to transplant these things. If you're running a sports franchise, that is a level and a depth of sort of, power that when you really understand it and start to honor that, can absolutely change the business. In terms of, in particular, how you price things and specifically with sponsors who, they have to pay for that association. Yeah. Because, we've joked about it for years and years and years, like, it's almost like a religious fanaticism that they have for that team. Well, actually the construct of that fanaticism is very similar to how people approach religion. So, there's literally basic, like, I would even say ancient needs in a person that are getting met in fandom, and sports is just such a great metaphor for it because we're really familiar with it. But, people are actually connecting their sense of identity with a team's brand. Yeah. And then they're finding like a large group to affiliate with, which every human needs as well. And so, being a fan of, let's say, the Atlanta Braves, you find other like-minded people who have sort of a similar worldview. And so, they actually crave being part of that large group because it's very transcendent, right? It makes them feel small. And when there's synchronicity of things happening, like we're all singing the same song at the same time and there's 40,000 of us, that literally has a almost pseudo spiritual effect for people. So that's why, we started to understand the irrationality of their spending in the space.
Yeah.
That's why if you manage a brand properly on a sports property side, and you don't make everything about price, which is kind of the irony because typically in sports we make everything about the ticket price, right?
Yep.
That's actually less of an issue for people than most team managements realize, because they think, oh, I've got a $15 ticket and includes a hot dog and a beer. Right. Well, that's actually going against why they want to be there. If you mitigate the value of it by putting such a small number on it, then it actually starts to curb what their expectation of the experience is. Right. That's the huge irony. So we work with a lot of teams to say, hey, you got to rethink your pricing strategy because you're actually shooting yourself in the foot right now.
Completely, because we've heard of this fragmentation of attention, but we're also getting that in fandom. Like, 20 years ago, you're in Atlanta, you're like, oh, there's 3-4 teams that we're competing against. Whereas these fandoms, like you said, are also outside of sports. So you're competing against the Marvel Universe, Star Wars, Taylor Swift, like all of these different fandoms, and the fan is getting pulled in different directions. So, like that, that experience piece. I talk about the MCG like it is a cathedral. When I go to the footy, it is an important piece. I think it's one of the things that the Australian market does well. And the membership piece, like I'm a member because it's part of my identity. I don't look at the number. I don't look at because I have to pay that number because I'm going to go. But if I'm not a member, it's like, well, hang on, I'm just giving up a piece of my irrationally giving up a piece of my identity. So, the fact that fans are being reached by multiple things, and that is both. It's an opportunity completely if they lean into it, like you said, but it's also a massive threat. 10 or 15 years down the track when you've got kids are now being bombarded to become fans of all these different things, and sport is just one of the choices that they've got in front of them because they've got so many now in a global world. Like, a kid in Atlanta can be following Real Madrid and never go to a game, and they could be all in on a team on the other side of the world.
Well, and I think that's happening all over the place right now. I think you're absolutely spot on. And again, this is why most of the work we do is helping teams understand, like, I don't even really know what my brand is. Do you know what I mean? Like I don't even know where to go, because this is a little bit like foreign language in some respects to teams. By the way, brand is a really overused term, and so that's part of the problem. A lot of teams think like, oh yeah, I'm managing my brand, and it's like actually, you don't even have your brand in a lot of instances articulated anywhere.
Yeah.
And by the way, a lot of them, they also think like, well, that's my logo and my team colors and my uniform. It's like, no, that's your visual identity. That's not your brand. That is derivative of your brand. So, but I think what we're seeing happening is there is definitely a movement with teams to realize like, holy cow, we got to get this right, because that's what we're selling off of. Right. And not just to individuals for tickets, but that's what we're selling off of to other brands or partners. And when they're coming in and asking like, well, can you explain your audience to us? Can you articulate your brand? Because by the way, that's what I'm going to buy association with. Yep. And a team says like, well, we don't really, we don't think about it that way. If I'm a brand manager, on the partnership side, I'm like, then I don't think I'm going to pay a premium for this.
Yeah.
Because I can buy the audience in a lot of other ways. right? I can buy it through broadcast. I can buy that audience digitally. I can geofence your space and actually serve them ads on their mobile devices, whether you like it or not. There's a lot of a really savvy brand marketer can get to your audience in a lot cheaper ways, if you can't sort of tell this story. I don't think most of them want to. I think most of them actually want to reach those audiences through the team because they know that's the optimal way to do it. But a team that's maybe a little immature in that space or disorganized in that space, I think that's real jeopardy to a brand, and I think they look at it that way.
So how, when you are talking to your commercial folk or your sponsorship folk that are talking to brands that want to have an association, you're right. There's they can just literally buy ads, geofence, all of those different things. How do you give your commercial guys the tools to help them understand, hey, this is the value of our brand. This is what we represent. This is what our fans are. How do you help them, I guess, talk the right language to sell that value?
Well, the first thing we really do is come in and actually create architecture for the brand, which sounds like a lot, but it can actually be done relatively quickly. Look, there's a team that we're doing this for right now that's 150 years old. And what I love about them is they're not embarrassed that they don't have this work. Yep. Do you know what I mean? It's kind of like, hey, look, we're not there. We need it. We know why we need it. And let's get this done. Yep. And so part of that is going in and literally breaking down. There's 5 pillars to that brand architecture. There's a process that we take the senior team through because we're not building the brand at that point. What we're really doing is drawing out of them what we need to be able to articulate the brand. And once we're able to do that, that articulation and that structure gets turned into what we call a brand narrative. And so, those brand pillars are not really anything that you kind of want to be outward facing with to the consumer, but the brand narrative is a very sort of simplified story or a distilled story of what all of that means that you can take out to the market. Yep. And so that's what we build marketing campaigns off of. But then with the sponsorship teams and the partnership teams, we really sit down and help them build their pitch decks to start with that. Okay. Right? Because really what that's saying to another partner is, this is who we are. This is the audience that we hold all of this tremendous relevance with that you're seeking. Right? And so that sets the stage for, we own it and we both know why it's valuable. And then it really becomes about, saying, let's not just pitch you assets. Let's actually, let's do a little discovery work with you to understand what you're trying to do in your business and how we can together build a strategy to address, those business issues. And then, oh, by the way, if you like that strategy, because we already know you like our audience, then we'll come back and we'll put assets in after the fact. Yep. And so now this, you'll notice that I haven't talked about price at all, right? Yep. Because budget doesn't even come up in that equation, because if they love the strategy, it's amazing what they'll pay for. Yeah. I had a client who literally fell so in love with a strategy and a concept we came up with for them that they dropped 2 other professional teams to move that spend to this particular property to afford the idea. Yep. Right. So that's sort of, I think, again, demonstrates the power of when you put these pieces in place. And what I love is when sponsorship teams see that work, they don't have to be sold on doing it that way anymore. No. Right? Because they start to get real feedback from the brands going oh my gosh, this is amazing. None of the other teams we buy from do this. They don't talk this language. This is so great. I can go back to our brand manager or our brand director and I can show them this deck, which helps them get the money they need. Right. But
it is a retraining of the process, both on, I guess, the team side and your commercial team side, but also for a lot of the brands, because a lot of them come into it with their set expectation of, what are the assets am I going to get? What are the hospitality options am I going to get? How much reach is, they come at it very functionally without looking at, oh, hang on, you actually can drive these key metrics for my business. Of course I want to do it that way. But they, there's a little bit of the sponsorship model is broken because there's this brokering of assets and audiences that people think they're the hoops we have to jump through. Whereas diving into the actual problem, what is your problem? How can we solve it? How can we move our church to your audience, to that problem? Is sometimes a little bit big for some people to tackle.
It is, and it can be a little daunting because you're absolutely right. You are starting to change processes at that point, and that's why typically the work we're doing when we first come in is at a very senior level, because you just have to have buy-in from senior leadership to make those kind of changes. But that's actually surprisingly not that difficult to get because they understand what's at stake financially.
Yep.
And so it's easier for them. Like, we don't ever make this about like, hey, we want to come in and talk about your brand. Brand is codified for strategy.
Yep.
And strategy in a business is about making money so that the business can, continue to flourish and hopefully grow. So even when we talk about brand, we really shape it through that lens because it has to be. Otherwise, it seems like, we're spending a lot of time and a lot of money, and I don't know how this is going to connect back to revenue.
Yeah.
And so a lot of times with marketers, our coaching and counseling to them is like, hey, don't get so sort of myopically caught up in your craft that you forget that you're actually here to help this business make money.
Yeah.
And so when we think of fandom, like, the one thing that we say over and over and over again to both marketers and the partnership team is, when you really start to understand this construct, you have to honor it.
Yeah.
Because what we know is the number one thing that breaks fandom down is poor commercialization.
Mm-hmm.
When people feel like the thing that they love has been poorly commercialized, they get really upset because you have basically intervened in a very important relationship. So, they look at you as basically the thing that broke apart them and the thing that they love.
Yeah.
And again, I have reams of research that basically proves that out as true. And so when you really start talking to the sponsorship team to say, look, it's not that sponsorship is wrong or can't be done well, you just have to be really thoughtful and you have to honor the depth of where that fandom comes from. Because remember, it's not rational. It's very irrational, which means it comes from a part of the brain where there's no capacity for language, and it's where all emotion is stemmed from. Right. So you can't have a rational conversation with a fan when you have breached that trust because they're not even thinking about it in that part of their brain. It's super fascinating stuff.
Well, thank you very much. We want to wrap things up here. I'm talking to Peter Sorckoff from SeaWorld with the Sports Geek Closing 5. Do you remember the first sports event you ever attended?
I did. The first sports event I attended was a Team Canada, Team Russia hockey game.
Okay.
It was in the Saddle Dome in Calgary, and I remember it because I was a huge Wayne Gretzky fan, and he was the last guy on the ice in the pregame warm-up, and I was screaming so loud he actually flipped a puck up on the blade of his stick and threw it up to me, which by the way, I still have that puck.
Oh, terrific. I did post a throwback to a Wayne Gretzky fan club. And I think it must have, I don't know where it was, from a magazine or something, but it was effectively one of these early subscription services where you would send a letter to Wayne, and for $7.99 you would get a signed photo and a newsletter once a quarter or something. And I'm like, way before his time, the great one, definitely.
Well, by the way, I got to meet him later in my career. I actually told him that story. He's the only sports figure that I was really actually nervous to meet. And I've had a good fortune to meet a lot of athletes, but I was so nervous to meet him because I'd held him on such a high pedestal that I was worried he wasn't going to be all that when I met him. Yep. And by the way, he was all that and more. Oh,
terrific. You would have also been to a lot of sports events and been to the growing gourmet opportunities in sport at sports events. Do you have a favorite food memory or a go-to food when you're at a sports event?
Go-to food. I'm a big hot dog guy at a baseball game. There's just something about I don't know, one of those foot-long dogs at a baseball game. I don't know if it actually tastes better or if it's just the environment that you're eating it in, but I love to load a hot dog up with all kinds of condiments. And, I know I'm going to have heartburn after, but it's still worth it every time.
But again, it goes into that fandom, irrational part of the experience, part of the ritual of sport is that experience.
Without question. And look, you can get a hot dog anywhere, right? But for some reason it feels like, and it tastes like, you can only get a ballpark hot dog in a ballpark.
Yeah, completely. What's the first app you open in the morning?
First app I open up in the morning, other than email, there's two that I like, actually. There's one called Totally Modern. It's just a aggregated sort of deals of the day, but it's really, really cool stuff.
Okay.
And I always love taking a peek in that. It's one of my, probably the 7 that get opened up every day on my phone. I travel a lot. I fly a lot. Inevitably, my Delta app gets opened.
Okay. Is there someone that you either follow, work with, read, that the podcast listeners should follow, and why?
Yeah, I'm a really big fan. If the fandom stuff resonates with any of your listeners at all, I would tell them to go look up Jonathan Haidt. His last name is Haidt, and he's written a couple fantastic books. One of them is called The Happiness Hypothesis. That's probably the best one to read first. It's the easiest one to get through, but work your way up to The Righteous Mind. The Righteous Mind will really help you understand that irrationality of fandom in a way that's honestly a little bit unfair. When you really get it, it's sort of unfair that you understand how it works. Okay,
I'll check that out. Jonathan Haidt. I will put the links in the show notes. Lastly, what social media platform is your MVP? What's your go-to platform?
I'm an Instagram guy. I'm a voyeur on it. I'm very, very specific about and curate what's on there. Mostly because I get a lot of inspiration from Instagram, to be honest with you. I have a gazillion different sort of magazine subscriptions because I just feel like you get a lot of different stuff from great magazines.
Yep.
But I feel like Instagram is like the ultimate in being able to sort of flip through 30 different magazines in, 2 or 3 minutes when you're just kind of killing time. Which is why I'm so sort of diabolical about how I curate what's in my feed.
Yeah, it does seem to be the place digitally on the internet where the most creativity is being poured into at the minute, on how they do it. Like and more so on the story side, how can that be used? But then also, what does the feed look like? The theme of the feed. What are you trying to do in that space? It does seem to be drawing a lot of creatives from multiple areas, not just the world of sports, but looking at how fashion are using it, how technology are using it. It's a very easy palette to work with.
It's also, I think, really convenient as a consumer when you find something you like to actually be able to buy. So, I know that's been a bugaboo for a lot of sports executives and teams trying to figure out how do I sell a ticket through a social channel, and maybe Facebook is, of course, they own Instagram, but Facebook's probably got the best integration in that way from a ticket perspective. But I just think broadly for consumers, Instagram's just got it figured out in a way that I'm sure everybody else is envious of.
Terrific. What is the best way for people who are listening to this podcast to reach out to you, say they enjoyed the podcast and want to know more about what you do? What is the best way for them to reach out to you?
Well, look, they can, if they're, again, intrigued by any of what we talked about, the website is seer.world. And literally, they can send me an email. I'm just peter@sear.world. And, I'm always interested in meeting new people and chatting and learning new things from new people, especially around the world. So, one of the things I love about, what you've been able to do, Sean, is, not just create this channel, but, that sense of adventure that you have in being in all places, all over the place is honestly really inspiring to me. So the opportunity to be here and know that I'm going to be able to sort of reach a few of those people is a bit of a gift. And so thank you for that.
Oh, thank you very much for the kind words. Like I said to everyone who's listening, please reach out and tell the guests that you've listened and what you've gleaned from it. Peter, thank you very much for coming on the podcast. Look forward to catching up at a conference or a sports event sometime soon when I'm next in your part of the world, or you're in my part of the world.
Well, I was going to say, hopefully that happens when I'm in your part of the world selfishly.
Yes, no problems. All right. Cheers, mate.
You bet.
New workshops on audience, content, distribution, valuation, and pitch following Sports Geek's Digital to Dollars process. Go to digitaltodollars.com.
Thanks again to Peter Sorckoff. You can follow him on Twitter, Peter Sorckoff, SORCKOFF, not zero, OFF. And you can connect with Peter on LinkedIn, Peter Sorckoff. You can find him the links to Peter's socials and Sear and the like, as discussed on the podcast, will be in the show notes, sportsgeekhq.com/260. Before I wrap up, just a little bit of update on Digital to Dollars and how it's being implemented. If you're listening for the first time, Digital to Dollars is a process we've developed working with teams over the last 10 years on helping them understand their digital presence and helping them commercialize that with their partners. It goes across 5 pillars: know your audience, know your content, know your distribution, know your value, and know your pitch. Recently, we just did it with a local league here, where we did the first 3 pillars in a workshop format, in a full-day workshop with digital team, commercial team, media, content team, all participating. We're now in the process of following up with that homework of defining those audience personas, doing the content audit, doing the content matrix to see where all the content is getting published. And then we'll be following up, looking at the know your value piece. Once we know what the content is being produced, we can start looking at what the rate card will look like, and we can start talking to sponsors in a manner and talking around the same language that your digital team is. So if you're interested in something like that, if you're struggling to commercialize your digital or have that conversation with your sponsors, or you're having a disconnect between digital and commercial, that's exactly where Digital Dollars fits in. You can check out more at digitaltodollars.com, or simply send me an email, sean@sportsgeekhq.com. And then also, if that is too big to bite, it's too big to take on, if you just need assistance with a campaign or a particular content issue or a particular platform, or looking to something to tackle and you just want to pick my brain, you can do so. Just go to sportsgeekhq./pick my brain. And you can get a 2-hour consulting session via Zoom, where we dive in on your problems or campaign or where you want to start. So please check that out, sportsgeekhq.pick my brain. Then lastly, send in some questions. Send in your questions for the Q&A episode. Was there a topic you'd like to know a little bit more on from my chat with Peter Sorckoff today? Do you want me to dive in more about brand or understanding brand, or potentially how we went through the branding process to Gravitas? Please send them in. We're running that every Friday, 3 questions each week. I really appreciate the people that are sending in questions, including former guests sending in questions so far. But I really love your feedback. One of the things that we do when we're doing new content pieces is that we give them enough time to breathe to see if they work. So we will have 9 episodes done by the end of the year. We'll probably sit back then and look at the stats, get your feedback, and see what we can do to improve and tweak the Q&A episodes. But I need your questions, so please send them in either via social media or Sean@sportsgeekhq.com. As always, you can sign up and support our podcasting and newsletter efforts at Patreon, sportsgeekhq.com/Patreon. Until next episode, my name is Sean Callanan, and you've been listening to Sports Geek.
Join Sports Geek Nation access to exclusive Slack and Facebook groups with regular Q&A sessions with Sean Callanan. Go to sportsgeeknation.com to join. Need help with your digital rate card? Not sure how to price your assets? Is there a disconnect between digital and commercial? That is where Sean works best, in digital divorce counselor mode. Book a time for a call with Sean to discuss the Sports Geek process. Go to sportsgeekhq.com/phone call.
Go to sportsgeekhq.com for more sports digital marketing resources.